Now, we have some very sad news to report to you this afternoon here at Times Towers. Our colleague, Times radio presenter and Sunday Times columnist Rod Liddle has died. We've had that news into the Times today, and we have also been waiting to respectfully inform all of you about this until all of his family had known. And we will carry on talking about Rod Liddle's contribution both to the Sunday Times and to Times Radio throughout the programme this afternoon. We're hoping that we will be able to be joined by Ben Taylor, editor of the Sunday Times, in just a couple of moments' time. But I know that many of you will have thoroughly enjoyed his contribution to this radio station and his show, where he always spoke his mind. He had a very clear love of radio, and in fact both Jane and I knew him back in the day at BBC Radio 4, so we will carry on talking about our thoughts and memories too. But it's always very shocking, I think, when you're listening to a radio station, somebody that you might have actually contacted from time to time, and you might have read many of his columns in the Sunday Times. So very sad news this afternoon that Rod Liddle has died.
He was a very distinctive figure, wasn't he? He did enjoy dressing in black back in the day. I can still see him, lopping along Wood Lane in West London on his way between Television Centre and a very particular wine bar. That was Rod, wasn't it?
It was Rod, and he really stood out at Radio 4 when he was editor of the Today programme. It was still a place where many people were suited and booted during their working day, and as you rightly say, he always appeared as a bit of a Johnny Cash figure striding down the corridors. And he was also known as a maverick. It's a very, very overused term sometimes in the creative industries, but he did really shake things up at Radio 4. He did things his way, and he'd also been on a huge journalistic journey because he wrote for The Guardian. He was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. He also campaigned for the Labour Party. He made his way through the doors of The Spectator, and he found himself at the Sunday Times.
Yeah, I mean, he was a provocateur. I think that wouldn't be an unreasonable thing to say.
And he enjoyed that position very much.
Yeah, he absolutely did. Should we have a little listen? This is Rod opening his very first programme on Times Radio in the January of last year.
Hello, this is Rod Liddle on Times Radio in the first of what I hope will be a momentous series of landmark broadcasting, a little like the Reith Lectures, except entirely devoid of any vestige of gravitas, principle or sincerity. I hope you'll stay with me as we disinter and rummage through the entrails of the important political stories of the week, as well as everything compelling thrown up by this country's strange and vibrant culture.
Well, rummage through the entrails. Gosh, what a phrase. Let's talk now to Ben Taylor, editor of the Sunday Times. Hello, Ben.
Good afternoon.
Very good afternoon to you. What would your first memory of Rod be?
He was cantankerous. I first started to speak to him when I became deputy editor 6 years ago, and when Emma Tucker, my predecessor, was off, I would handle Rod's column, and it was always a blessing and a curse. He was just he refused to accept any received wisdom of the day, which is obviously the first rule of any columnist. But then we would end up having these wonderful arguments, which would end up in me agreeing with him by the end of it all. And the joy of Rod was, and I think that many who've dealt with him will know this, you start to develop a real friendship with him. And the reaction from the newsroom this morning, or this today, has been one of sadness that we'll no longer be able to have those wonderful conversations with him every week.
So we were just talking very briefly, Ben, about the journey that Rod had been on journalistically, because there aren't very many people who have managed to turn such a corner, and he really did politically, didn't he?
Well, he didn't actually. I think that students of Rod's columns would have seen that he dressed to the right on certain issues and dressed to the left on others. I think he was very hard to pigeonhole, and often he would surprise you. For example, many listeners may not be aware he was a huge backer of animal rights in a way that you may not have expected. He was very fond of the animal kingdom and would often write affectionately about that. Very anti-hunting, for example, which you may not have predicted. And I do think what gave Rod his depth was the fact that he had, if you like, worked in all areas of the media. He'd heard all the arguments before. He's a very clever man. He had a deep intellect, and I think what irritated him was lazy thinking.
Sure.
And I think that was, if there was one sentence that would sum him up, was that he was irritated by complacency, lazy thinking, and those who thought they knew best.
And actually, at the BBC, it is exactly that enabled him to cut such a swathe, because although he could definitely show disdain for the BBC, he had an absolute love of the opportunities that it presented for people to tell their stories, to produce some superb journalism, and also to cock a little bit of a snook at an establishment from another part of the establishment.
Yeah, I mean, clearly I didn't work with him at the BBC, but those who did tell me exactly the same. Fee, and I think that the truth about Rod was that he came from local papers, which I always think is really important, a bit like local radio. So he worked for the South Wales Echo. In fact, I worked out that him and I were in the same building at the same time in 1989. I'd probably been too scared to talk to him because I was only 18. But he had that grounding, which I think really, really informed his journalism throughout his career. And I think people like him, I'm afraid, are growing rarer and rarer. Those people who come up through the regions and understand Britain in a way that maybe some of contemporary journalists don't. And I think that was part of his charm, and also his and what gave him profundity when sometimes people dismissed him as a controversialist. I also think that he just loved ideas and debating, and I think his Times Radio show, I think, was an example of that, which we launched together, as you know, in January 2025. And I think it gave us, a different type of show on a Saturday morning to any of the competition.
Would Rod have been the type of person, Ben, who would enjoy us talking about him? I mean, for Jane and I, we did know him when we were at the BBC. We were deeply, deeply shocked today when our boss told me about his death, told us about his death. But both of us also felt that he would probably smile a little bit that we were then having this conversation about him. What do you think?
I think in one word, no. I think you're both right. I think that this was a man who would have, I don't know, just would probably have disdained tribute and ignored the platitudes, not from you two, but that may come out from people who he didn't particularly care for. I think that he was a one-off. Not many columnists, not many journalists, I should say, are irreplaceable, but I do think Rod will be, in that sense, irreplaceable. I repeat that I think he gave his column a great deal of thought. He gave the shorts a great deal of thought, the sort of small items next to the main column. And one thing I would point out was that his digital audience was growing, year by year, and that there was a really good modern audience out there for him. And I think that it was very interesting to see that if you combine quality of writing with quality of argument, you still win over new audiences today, which is gratifying.
Thank you very much indeed for talking to us this afternoon. That is Ben Taylor. So very sad news if you're just joining us. Our colleague here at Times Radio and colleague on the Sunday Times, Rod Liddle, has died. His death was announced by his family earlier today.
I think Rod will be actually rather pleased by the number of people who've already contacted Times Radio to say how sad they are. And also, I think he'd be quite chuffed by the few people who have said that they didn't agree with anything he ever wrote.
Well, he'd love that.
But he would absolutely love it. That was sort of the point. If you want to add to the list of people who've been in touch, you can easily do it. 0333 00 2353. Have I got that right? 0333 003 2353.
That one rolled off the tongue a bit better.
Yeah, it did, didn't it? Eileen says, I'm so sad to hear about the death of Rod Liddle. I thought he was just brilliant. Tony says, I'm so shocked at the news of Rod Liddle's passing. Good bloke, great broadcaster. May he rest in peace. Diana just says she's really sorry to hear about it. Andy, I'm broken-hearted to hear about dear Rod's death. He just broadcasted with a twinkle. The world is a poorer place without him. And from Keith, very sad to hear about Rod. The weekend won't be the same. Francine, I've missed him on Saturdays. Was looking forward to him coming back. I'm very, very sad to hear this rotten news. And it's a shock, I think, to a lot of people.